The Evil Within is one of the most tragic stories when it comes to survival horror franchises, as this series delivered 2 fantastic entries, yet we'll probably never see the day where it becomes a trilogy. As of yesterday, the team behind the Evil Within franchise, Tango Gameworks, along with 3 other Bethesda-owned studios, were shut down by Microsoft in favor of focusing on bigger titles. Now honestly, I had this video planned to release today even before this announcement broke. But now this video hits harder as it's a reminder of the potential that this series and its developers had. The Evil Within games were both phenomenal, and each of them had a lot of things to appreciate. From the atmospheric horror to the original and intriguing storyline. The Evil Within games are without a doubt some of the best survival horror games out there. One of the most interesting features of these games though were the boss fights. The boss fights in the Evil Within games are vastly different from each other, as they explore different and unique mechanics to defeat each of them. From terrifying Lord Reborn, whose only weakness is fire, to a man that can slow down and even freeze down time. The Evil Within franchise has some of the most iconic boss fights seen in survival horror games. So in this episode of Nerds Based Games, I'm diving into both games as I locate the top 10 best boss fights of the series. Just to be clear, I'm only taking a look at the 2 main stories of the game, which excludes any DLC boss fights. However, any boss featured in the main story of either game will be considered for today's list. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel if you like the content that I bring you guys. Also leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerds Based Games, and this is my tribute to the Evil Within franchise with its top 10 best boss fights of the franchise. Let's get it. Number 10, Ruvik, The Evil Within. Part of me didn't want to include this boss fight because honestly, it's not exactly great compared to many other fights of the series. With that being said, visually speaking, this fight is definitely one of the more memorable ones. The fight begins with Ruvik pretty much bending the reality of STEM. Buildings are crashing and moving all over, cars are being thrown all over the place, and Ruvik is transforming into this enormous creature with a pretty big ass brain. Sebastian is literally tossed all over the place like a ragdoll. He'll have to run across collapsing terrains and jump onto a moving vehicle to use the attached machine gun on it to deal damage to Ruvik. Eventually, poor Sebastian will find himself impaled and will need to use a rocket launcher to defeat and kill Ruvik before he reaches him. Again, the fight itself doesn't really stand out in terms of its gameplay, especially when you compare it to other entries. However, it's visually impressive and one of the best looking boss fights of the franchise. Also, Ruvik's real name is Ruben, and obviously I gotta be a little biased there, don't I? Number 9, The Guardian, Evil Within 2. Essentially, Evil Within 2's version of Laura, the Guardian is a recurring enemy that chases Sebastian throughout the majority of the game. While in my opinion, she's nowhere near as terrifying as Laura, the Guardian is still both scary and pretty intimidating. In most cases, you can just avoid her and run away. However, at one point in the game, you'll have no choice but to fight her. Luckily, the area you fight the Guardian in is pretty expansive and is littered with ammunition and resources all around. But because of the Guardian's speed, avoiding her attacks seems easier said than done. Her laughter as she chases you while trying to brutally kill you is terrifying, and using the environment to make quick work of her is very satisfying. Like for example, when you manage to lure her into a pool of gasoline and get off a shot in time to light her on fire, will have you cheering in satisfaction. She unfortunately doesn't move higher on this list due to her fight not having any unique features or unique solutions like other entries above her have. Number 8, Obscura, Evil Within 2.
Meet my beautiful Obscura.
What I really enjoy about most of the boss fights in the Evil Within franchise is the unique mechanics or solutions behind defeating the bosses of the series. Take Obscura for example. Obscura is essentially a disturbing monster with the face of a camera, making it the perfect guard dog of Stefano. In the official fight against it, Obscura has abilities similar to Stefano himself, in which it can take photos that'll slow down time. In the battle area, there's a device with the timer. The goal of this fight is to let the device's time run out in order for the fight to end. However, Obscura uses its time pausing ability to stop the clock on the device, therefore delaying your escape. In order to start the timer again, you'll need to do damage to Obscura by shooting its camera, aka the head. By doing this, Obscura's time stopping ability will phase out and the timer will continue to count down. Rinse and repeat until the timer hits 0. Number 7. Amalgam Alpha, Evil Within. A lot of people would argue that this is the best boss fight of the franchise, and for good reason. In terms of the difficulty, it's up there as one of the harder fights of the franchise. Facing off against it in a parking garage, the battle area is pretty expansive, while not being too big. Because of the size of this creature, having a lot of room to allow the beast to meet its true potential is vital, but not at the risk of creating too much space to where you can just sit on the sidelines and snipe this creature. On top of its massive size, the creature is also surprisingly fast. It can close the distance quickly between you and it, even if you are sitting on the opposite side of the garage. Oh, and for those of you that might try to hide out in one of those random rooms around the garage, you better think twice. This monster will bust through and drag your ass out of there without hesitation. So no trying to cheat this bitch. Not saying that I ever tried. Like most boss fights of the franchise, using the environment to your advantage is key, as you'll want to use the cars and the storage rooms with perfectly timed dodges to get a shot at its weak spot. Overall, the monster design is phenomenal, and the fight against him in the garage is a lot of fun. Number 6. Anima, Evil Within 2.
What the?
Without a doubt, Anima is the best optional boss of the Evil Within series. Well, she might just be one of the only ones. But still, it's pretty awesome and kind of sad when you think about it. Awesome because those of us willing to explore every nook and cranny are then treated to a completely unique experience that basically adds a stalker enemy to your game. Sad for those unfortunate enough that never get to fully experience one of the best and scariest parts of the Evil Within 2, as they'll only encounter Anima if they find specific files or sections hidden throughout the game. Whatever the case, there's no doubt in my mind that Anima is the scariest part of the Evil Within series, and the fights against her are terrifying. Sure, there isn't any real combat when dealing with Anima, as the encounters with her are essentially stealth sections. But hey, it was a nice change of pace from the action-heavy gameplay of just about every other fight in this game. Plus, defeating Anima each time was like solving a difficult riddle or successfully making it through a maze in which Anima stalks you and instantly kills you if she manages to get her hands on you. Add that to the creepy ass singing that she does as she searches for you, which adds an additional layer of fear, and you have one of the scariest boss fights of the franchise. Number 5. The Matriarch, Evil Within 2. Before I say anything about this entry, I want to give a quick spoiler warning for the Evil Within 2. So while Ruvik was visually impressive, from gameplay point of view, he was a disappointment as the final boss of the first game. Luckily, the second game doesn't make that same mistake. After defeating Theodore, essentially the mastermind behind the events of the second game, Sebastian comes face to face with his own wife, Myra. Because she's been fully corrupted, Myra appears to be anything but human. As she attacks Sebastian, he's forced to shoot her, causing her to transform into a giant creature known as the Matriarch, which serves as the final boss of the game. Just like with most of the boss fights of the Evil Within 2, this fight features a specific mechanic that must be exploited in order to successfully defeat her. The Matriarch has weak spots on it, in which the player must shoot and destroy all of them, all the while she sends insect-like creatures after Sebastian. Destroying the weak spots causes the limbs to fall off of Myra, and even features some interactive moments that you'll need to react quickly to or face instant death. While the final fight here is still underwhelming for a final boss fight, it's definitely an upgrade compared to Ruvik. Plus, the stakes are much higher here, and therefore it makes the fight itself that much more exciting and interesting. Number 4, The Keeper, Evil Within. Technically, I should say keepers, plural, as at one point 2 of them come together to attack Sebastian. Whatever the case, the Keeper is one of my favorite boss fights of the first game. In fact, there's really only one fight that I like better than the Keeper in the first game, which we'll get to later on. Anyway, as I said at the start of the video, I'm including every single fight against the Keeper in this game. So basically, this includes the fight with the gas valves, the skippable meat locker fight, and the fight against 2 of them before reaching Ruvik. Anyway, the Keeper is a unique boss fight as it never fully dies and continues to come after Sebastian again and again. In the first fight, the goal is to release all the gas valves while holding him off. However, each time you defeat it, it'll just revive itself in another safe. This continues until Sebastian escapes the area and crushes the box with spikes. I'll skip over the meat locker sequence as it's skippable, but the more interesting fight that I want to talk about is the fight against 2 Keepers. In this sequence, you'll have to time things out right and use the levers to help split the Keepers up to make them easier to defeat. While none of the Keepers are extremely difficult to fight, something about the design of these monsters and the fact that they keep coming back over and over again makes it one of the more interesting bosses of the franchise. Number 3, Theodore, Evil Within 2.
I see you've overcome some of your guilt and pain. But the depth of your past traumas is vast. I know everything about you. I know what lies beneath. You have a deep well of fear from which to draw. You've seen many horrors, and they still haunt your memories. Remember where this all began. Remember Beacon.
Father Theodore is actually the main antagonist of the Evil Within 2, despite not being the final boss and despite not appearing until halfway through the game. Eventually, we learn that Theodore's goal is to use Stem and the Core to control Morbius and bend them to his will. And because the Core is none other than Sebastian's daughter, Lily, obviously Theodore and Sebastian eventually come face to face for one final showdown. Father Theodore uses the fears of Sebastian to face him instead of fighting him directly, which actually creates a bunch of fan service that I really appreciate. By that, I mean that Theodore calls upon previous boss fights that Sebastian faced off against during his time in Beacon Mental Hospital. More specifically, Theodore's boss fight is broken up into 3 phases. Phase 1 is against the first boss of the first game, the Sadist. This is the chainsaw enemy that chases Sebastian through the halls after entering Stem. In this phase, Sebastian just needs to run from one side of the hall to the other before eventually instantly defeating him. Phase 2 is where things start getting more interesting though. The last entry that we just talked about, the Keeper, makes his return in Theodore's fight. In the second phase, Sebastian needs to kill 3 Keepers in order to proceed to the final phase, 2 of which will attack him at the same time. The final phase is Laura Reborn, another fantastic boss of the first game. Similar to how Sebastian defeats her in the first game, the goal here is to use fire to burn her alive. The only difference here is that you don't have your matches from the first game to use on the bodies, and instead you focus on a few valves, a lever, and great timing to incinerate Laura once and for all. Honestly, Theodore is far from the hardest boss of the franchise, as each of these phases are relatively easy, with Laura being slightly more difficult than the rest, but due to the fan service and the callback to the original game, it's hard to not appreciate this fight a little more, hence why it earns a spot in the top 3. Number 2, Laura Reborn, Evil Within.
Shit, I'd better run!
I swear I didn't plan for this list to turn out this way. First we get the Keeper, then we get Theodore, who combines the Keeper and Laura into a single fight. Then we follow that up with Laura from the first game. All 3 of these entries are back to back on today's list. Focusing in on Laura, she's without a doubt the best boss fight of the first game, and to some, she may be viewed as the best boss of the franchise. Not to mention, she has one of the scariest entrances of all survival horror games. I would also argue that she's one of, if not the most difficult fight of the series. In the first game, Sebastian faces off against her a few times. Funny enough, you don't have to kill Laura in most of the encounters with her. And considering the rewards for defeating her is a mere 8,000 green gel, it doesn't actually make a ton of sense to waste your resources on her except for Chapter 5, which, unless I'm mistaken, is the only fight where you have to fight her. With that being said, defeating Laura as many times as possible, especially in those small contained areas of the final fight, is one of the most satisfying feelings that you'll get from the game. To be honest, you can probably choose whatever fight you want to represent Laura. Each of them are phenomenal and exciting in their own way. The terrifying entrance that Laura has in Chapter 4 and the adrenaline that you'll have as you race to escape her is one of the most memorable moments of the first game. The final fight where you'll need to use timing and patience with the gas valves to either escape her or finish her off before entering the elevator in Chapter 10 is probably the most difficult of the fights against her. However, my personal favorite goes back to Chapter 5's confrontation with Laura. Considering this is the only fight that actually forces you to face off against her, again, if I remember correctly, it's this fight that sticks with me more than every other. You'll need to use incinerators, traps, and even dead bodies and matches to your advantage to weaken Laura as much as possible before finishing her off in this fight. Her teleportation makes it hard to lock onto her, and her deadly instant kill attacks will make her one of the most challenging bosses of the game. And let me tell you, you better get used to that instant kill animation because you'll be seeing it a lot during your first few attempts at beating her in this fight. Number 1, Stefano Valentini, Evil Within 2.
Still time. For one last photo.
If you were to ask me who was the best villain of the Evil Within games, I would go back and forth between two people. Ruvik from the first game and surprisingly Stefano Valentini from the second game. Despite Father Theodore being the main antagonist of this game, Stefano is a far more interesting villain, and I'm kind of disappointed that we didn't get to see as much of this character as we got with Ruvik in the first game. If we did, there's a strong possibility that Stefano may have turned out better than Ruvik did. Unfortunately, that's not the case, but that doesn't take away from the fact that Stefano is without a doubt the best boss fight of the franchise. From the moment that we meet Stefano, we learn of his ability that allows him to freeze and slow down time after each photo that he takes. So of course, the fight against him will allow him to use this ability to his advantage. While battling Stefano, he can take photos to slow Sebastian down enough to grab him and deal a massive amount of damage. Plus, he's able to teleport and quickly make his way over to Sebastian, similar to Laura Reborn in the first game. Then, in his second phase, he enlists the help of Aperture, a giant camera lens complete with an eyeball that is supposed to signify Stefano's missing eye that he lost as a wartime journalist. Scattered throughout the battlefield are small sections complete with walls. During the second phase of Stefano's fight, Aperture will swing its massive tentacles down on the battlefield. To avoid them, the player needs to make their way over to one of these sections covered with walls. But trying to do so while Stefano is hot on your tails is easier said than done. The combination between Stefano's abilities, Aperture's attacks, and the visually appealing cinematics of the fight are exactly why Stefano's boss fight is the best of the franchise.
I had so much left to create. You've destroyed my legacy. Look at me. You made me into a masterpiece. Must record it. If only I had my camera. Where did it go?
But that's it for today's episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is Stefano Valentini the best boss fight of the Evil Within games, or is there a different fight that you think deserves that title? Let me know down below. Also, be sure to keep the developers suffering from the layoffs at Tango Gameworks and the other studios closed down by Microsoft in your thoughts and prayers. It sucks that game devs are always being treated this way despite bringing us some of the best video games out there, and hopefully these devs can find a new home with a different studio so that their talents don't go to waste. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.